Hello and welcome to Economy and Markets TV. We have conversations with a purpose. I'm your host, Dave Okenquist, Senior Research Analyst here at Dent. Joining me to take you around the world of economic and financial news and covering each topic in 2 minutes or less is the editor of Boom and Bust, Mr. Rodney Johnson. Rodney, good morning and thank you for coming on.
Morning, Dave.
Great to have you here as always to give your take on the news. Let's just get right into this week. We had US GDP final numbers for Q4 pushed down a bit from 2.6 to 2.2, giving the annual growth at 3%. Of course, that's inflation adjusted numbers. Just some highlights under the hood, something you noted in the copy today. Consumer spending was up 2.5%. Business spending a really healthy, basically 5.5%. That looks good. So, kind of, what are your final thoughts on 2018, and what do you see going ahead in 2019, at least the first quarter, or even the whole year ahead?
Well, we've always said that the market, or rather the economy, was going to slow down. We were going to get that first rush after tax reform and then down. And that looks like what happened.
Yep.
Business spending was good, but it wasn't fabulous. It wasn't just off the charts, which is what you would expect if you get this, huge amount of cash in your coffers because you're keeping more of your profits. And so it speaks to the same thing. There aren't a ton of opportunities out there that businesses didn't already know about. So there's not a lot for them to spend it on. We do watch, of course, the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now model. They say first quarter is at 1.5. That's much higher than I thought. I was thinking, really zero point 0.4, zero point 0.5. So we'll see. They've got a track record of being right. We'll go with them. If we get 1.5 or so, people will feel pretty good about this, even though, of course, it's a low number.
Yeah.
And so I think you'll see the markets breathe a sigh of relief. We won't know that, of course, until the last week of April when we get those reports for the first quarter. But a lot can happen between now and then. We've got earnings to get through. And so I think that fourth quarter GP at this point is really just a distant memory, and people are all about what's going on now.
Now, to your point about the first quarter GDP, watching that came out at basically where you estimated. I mean, it started at a really low level, and now it's finally starting to creep back up. One thing, just looking back to 2018 real quick, corporate profits went negative for the quarter. That was one of the things that came out in this final. Is that an indication of anything, or is it just do you make anything out of that?
Not really, because they're fairly volatile, has to do with a lot of underlying components. It's more of a trend.
Okay.
And since corporate profits were really good last year, of course, given tax reform, you would expect that. And so to have some give back now, I don't see it as a big thing. We should actually have a couple of quarters of flat or even negative corporate profits compared to 2018. But I think it's really all about current trends. So you had the 1 year that's up, but then, as they say, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
I just don't think we're going to get a whole lot of new corporate spending. So I don't think we're going to get a lot of activity out of it.
Excellent. So, Ronnie, let's move to housing. We had a couple of things that came out. Housing starts. They fell 8.7%. Single families down 17%. And within there, permits also fell 1.6%. We also had housing prices, the Case-Shiller 20 City Index. It fell 0.2%, up 3.6% for the year, which if you look at it on a chart, it's really kind of the smallest annual growth since, I believe, September of 2012. And then another thing here you didn't put in the copy, but pending home sales, those are down about 5% year over year. And that's, I believe, it's 14 straight months of a negative read. So what did you make of these things, these releases on housing this week, Rodney?
It's the trend we've been talking about. It's kind of like GDP is the trend we've been talking about with housing. Housing starts lower. It's really speaking to lower inventory because sales are not growing in terms of price. And so builders aren't rushing out to put more on the market because they're saying, why would I do that? And so without inventory, people don't have stuff to look at. They don't buy. It becomes a bit of a chicken and an egg. But the thing people aren't talking about this time around with housing starts and housing, mortgage rates are back to almost 4%, 4%. And so that huge run up last fall is gone. And yet we're not seeing activity rush back into the markets. And so the argument that last fall's drop in housing activity was driven by rising mortgage rates kind of falls flat now. I still think it's economic, right? You've talked about the Tampa market. You don't see those entry level or modest home prices really where you could get into the market. And then we have a lot of boomers with really high priced housing. They don't want to sell it at a discount, and there's not much of a market for it right now. So The market's kind of going to sleep. It's a little weird, which is unfortunate because this is where a lot of jobs are, right? Several percentage points of the economy. And so that is the worry that fixed residential investment will not add as much to GDP, which will hold down that number.
Yeah, great stuff on that, Ronnie. That's all I had. Let's move on to our next topic. We get some news out of on the great trade war between the United States and China, which looks like now. I think we've done this a couple of times now. It looks like we're finally going to break through with an agreement, but maybe. I mean, there was a report that came out, I believe, at 3 a.m. from Bloomberg that said both sides are going line by line, checking to make sure the language is correct for both Chinese and English, because we just don't trust the Americans. In other words, they just don't trust the Chinese and anything. So it's just trying to verify this. They said talks are over until President Xi comes and visits. So do you think that we're really this close, Rodney, to reaching an agreement?
I do. There was actually a report yesterday before the one you're talking about that said that the Chinese have made significant concessions on the two things left. I mean, we've already agreed on trade barriers. We've already agreed on access to markets. Those things are easy because they're obvious, right? You're charging a high amount for this. You're not allowing sales of that, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
It's the intellectual property and the technology transfer that are really the places where we bog down. And the Chinese hadn't budged on it. And, a number of reasons, save face, go back to the 18th century opium wars, blah, blah, blah. People have all sorts of stuff they want to talk about, but they weren't budging. And now it's been, almost a year. In May, it'll be a year that we started these, trade wars and tariffs. And so I think the Chinese are looking at it saying, wow, we really are struggling as they try to move their domestic economy to more consumption than fixed investment as they watch their exports fall. They're in a tough spot. And so they need this to go away. And so I'm glad to hear that they made some concessions. I want them to actually follow the agreement. That's the hard part, is enforcement. And I don't know what we've done on that. Right. And so if they're going line by line, that's a great report that we are making progress. Maybe this is over. I bet we see the markets pop pretty good on this, but it's not something I would buy into. It's something I would sell into.
Speaking of enforcement, there was a quote in there from White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow, who says what they want to do is have regular meetings and have the ability to raise tariffs without a countermeasure from China. That's basically what they're pushing for. I mean, is that asking too much, do you think?
Yeah, I who would agree to that, right? Would you agree to that? I think you've done something wrong. I want the ability to punish you, and you can't do anything. Yeah. Sign here. Who in the right mind's going to do that? I don't see it. Maybe he's gotten something that I'm not aware of, but even if somebody agreed to such a thing, if it ever came to pass, they would immediately say you were wrong, you violated, and they would raise tariffs too, blah, 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 blah. So,
yeah, well, I guess you start high and then you work your way to something more reasonable, right?
I guess.
Okay. Another thing, Rodney, that came out, I believe this was actually last Friday, but sort of it's been dominating the news this week. Special Counsel Robert Mueller delivered his report to the Attorney General, from which the Attorney General issued a 4-page summary, basically saying that no members of the Special Counsel found that no members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with Russia. The Attorney General also added that, in his opinion, there was no obstruction of justice. But we don't want to dig into all of this, but mostly what this means for the economy and the markets. And is the worst over necessarily?
Well, it's over until Trump does the next thing, right? I mean, my goodness, his victory lap was cut short by, you call it a quarter mile. It was cut short by almost a quarter mile because then he jumped into the Affordable Care. Right. The collusion thing, it seemed likely that it wasn't going to go toward collusion because it took so long. I've always been a subscriber of the theory that you just can't have a conspiracy that big because people can't keep it to themselves. The conspiracy requires some secrecy, and there's just too many people. And so if he didn't find anything in the first couple of weeks where he had a lot of access, it'd be really unusual for anything to be there later on. Much more likely was obstruction, right? Where somebody lies, somebody, tries to cast themselves in a better light along the way. And so they're convicted of saying, hey, you didn't, give the full truth, or you kind of put this in a different light, versus actual collusion. And so on that measure, Trump's team did a good job of having him not ever sit down, because that's where you get tricked up. But to the markets, they just didn't respond, right? Yeah. And so they said, look, old news. We didn't really think there was anything there. There wasn't anything there. Move on. It means a lot to political commentators. It certainly means a lot to viewership on some of the cable networks. But to people investing, they just kind of pushed it aside and moved on to the next thing. Trade will be much bigger.
Well, I just find this funny now because we've got we had these bombshell reports over the past 2 years that tanked the market, and I guess it turned out to be nothing. But it would seem like it'd be really good news that as an independent investigative body has declared, no, the president is not a traitor. Uh, but what you're saying is this is just another little bump in the long road of Trump chaos, and that's it. We're just moving on.
No, don't confuse the two. What happened is at the beginning, there was a lot of speculation as to what it might be. But the
Right.
longer it dragged on without indictments for crimes like that, the crimes were tax and other stuff, it got further from the possibility of that being the case because he would have found it so much sooner. And
Gotcha.
so I believe myself, as many other people, said, look, the further away you get from the original charge, the less likely it is that charge is going to be what's the case. And that's kind of what it was. At the beginning, if he had been found to collude with the Russians and, of course, went through impeachment, the markets would be out of control, which you would expect because we would be in chaos. But the further away you got, the less likely it became. The chaos lessened to the normal chaos of the Trump presidency. Let's go there.
Gotcha. So the markets had basically priced this good news in.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, great. Well, that's all we had for this week. Looking ahead to next week, we've got the U.S. jobs report, which is always a big one. We've got reports on durable goods, retail sales, and minutes from the ECB meeting. We'll see what the latest scheme they've concocted over in Europe. Anything else you have your mind on, Rodney?
Brexit is the thing. A hard Brexit is a weird one, and we've kind of become not immune to it, but we've kind of decided, I guess it's okay. But if they do a hard Brexit, it's going to be weird, crazy, and this is still the fifth largest economy on the planet, Great Britain.
Yeah.
And so it could cause some great disruptions. And the Eurozone is really struggling with almost no growth, with an ECB that it looks like it's going to go backwards on its latest moves and become even more dovish than it has been. And they're still not out of the woods with bad loans in Italy and Spain and Greece. And so there's a lot going over there that we just got tired of, but it's still a problem. And that could be a very difficult spot for 2019.
Absolutely, Rodney. Rodney, thank you so much for joining me this week and giving your thoughts as you do each and every week. Thank you all for watching, and we'll recap the news for you next week.